Namaskar and welcome to the 9th lecture on Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, which comes under the paper Indian Writing in English, MAG 7, Block 2. My name is Lalit Kumar. I teach English at Deen Dayal Upadhyaya College, University of Delhi. The title of this lecture is Nation, Religion and Modernity in Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. The lecture has two main objectives. One is to examine the emergence of a national culture or modern Indian nation during the colonial period, especially its portrayal, its representation in the given book, that is Anand's Untouchable. And the other is to analyze the representation of Hinduism, Islam and Christianity in Untouchable, apart from a close examination of Gandhi's views on the relation between religion and untouchability. I must point out here that the text, that is Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, does not deal specifically with the question of nationalism, but draws our attention to a set of exclusions that the outcasts are subjected to in colonial nation. The focus of this lecture will be on the narratives of this very exclusion, the aforesaid exclusion and deprivation of the outcasts in modern Indian nation during the colonial times. And a good starting point here is to ask the question, to what extent the untouchables were the beneficiaries of colonial modernity and its offshoots such as modern law, education, science and technology, democracy, rational beliefs, equality of opportunity and above all a life of dignity. I would like to rephrase this question in the immediate context of the novel, which is why Bhakha has been called a child of modern India. Is he truly a child? Is he truly a beneficiary of modern India? Is it a literal statement or an ironic one? Or is it because Bhakha, quote unquote, the child of modern India, likes to imitate European ways and become a mimic man, or because he wants to go to his school, study English, become a sahib, aspiring to be a beneficiary of the progress made in modern India, roam freely in the temple and around the well, play hockey without the fear of being abused, amble down the public road freely without the fear of being slapped for polluting someone, live under no pressure to consume the uneaten food from the plate of an upper caste man in the wedding feast, let his younger sister roam around freely with no fear of being molested, enjoy the freedom of being treated by a hakim on falling ill, as it has been shown in the story when Bhakha falls ill, a doctor or hakim refuses to treat him initially only because he is an untouchable. And above all, breathe without bearing the burden of deposing human excrement. All these are the aspirations of the child of modern India. Bhakha, whatever I have mentioned here, and Bhakha is unable to get all the benefits. And these are not Bhakha's aspirations alone, because these aspirations represent the desires of every Dalit. So these were not only Bhakha's, but Gandhi's, Ambedkar's and Mulk Raj Anand's aspirations too for Dalits in modern Indian nation. And this idea can be discussed further with reference to Gandhi-Ambedkar debate in the 1930s. I mean the aspirations that Bhakha expresses in this novel should be analyzed with reference to Gandhi-Ambedkar debate that took place in the 1930s. Gandhi saw caste as a social issue, whereas Ambedkar as a political one. The latter rather believed that social reforms alone will not uplift the condition of Dalits, but political empowerment. So Ambedkar wanted Dalits to politically empower themselves. And I quote Ambedkar, "I want political power for my community. That is indispensable for our survival," unquote. This is what he told Gandhi in 1932, just before the Pune Pact. Therefore, Ambedkar insisted on separate electorates, which Gandhi vehemently opposed. Though, let me emphasize here, though there is no reference to Ambedkar in the novel, Anand makes Gandhi criticize separate electorates in his speech, which Bhakha finds entirely difficult, utterly difficult to follow. So, there is a huge gap between these aspirations that Bhakha expresses, that Bhakha wishes, and their fulfillment in the colonial India of the 1930s, when the exclusion of the outcasts from several spaces of importance, from several public spaces, was the norm. So, now in the next part of my lecture, I would like to look at all sorts of exclusion in terms of spaces. What are the spaces, what are the prominent spaces from where Dalits were excluded? And the first is educational space. So, let me explain how Bhakha and other Dalits during the colonial India were excluded from educational spaces. Bhakha, as the readers of the novel would know, wishes to be a Sahib. He wants to be a Sahib. His uncle, who worked at the British barracks, had told him that he would have to go to school if he wanted to be a Sahib. And I quote from the novel, and he had wept, Bhakha had wept. Bhakha had wept and cried to be allowed to go to school. But then his father had told him that schools were meant for the babus, not for the lowly sweepers. He hadn't quite understood the reason for that. Then, later, at the British barracks, he realized why his father had not sent him to school. He was a sweeper's son and could never be a babu. So, equality of opportunity is something that Bhakha, the child of modern India, missed in the 1930s. And therefore, this painful realization dawns upon him that a sweeper's son can never be a babu. As soon as the younger son of an influential babu mentions his school, Bhakha's daydreaming begins. And he continues to daydream, he continues to drift. The anxiety of going to school, how beautiful it felt, I quote, how beautiful it felt. How nice it must be to be able to read and write. One could read the papers after having been to school. One could talk to the sahibs. One wouldn't have to run to the scribe every time a letter came. And one wouldn't have to pay him to have one's letters written, because many members of the depressed classes had to pay money to scribes in order to write, in order to get a letter written. He had often felt like, Bhakha had often felt like reading Waris Shah's Heer and Ranjha, and he had felt a burning desire while he was in the British barracks to speak the, and I am quoting, to speak the tismish which the Tommies spoke. So, Bhakha wanted to speak English in a similar fashion, tismish, like the Britishers, like the British soldiers. So, perhaps it was Mulk Raj Anand who, like Jyotirao Phule and Bhimrao Ambedkar, recognized the transformative potential of education, especially English education, for Dalits. And therefore, it was Ambedkar who gave the slogan of educate, agitate and organize at the All India Depressed Classes Conference in 1942. Ambedkar here added that English was the milk of a lioness, and only those who drink it will roar. It is not surprising, therefore, that Bhakha's dream to speak English like the Britishers, tismish, is shared by millions of Dalits. Here it's worth mentioning that recently in the Baka village of Uttar Pradesh, at the instance of Dalit author and activist Chandrabhan Prasad, a temple of goddess English has been built. The well-dressed bronze statue of the goddess of English, is sporting a hat, holds a pen in her right hand and a book, that is the Constitution of India, in her left hand. So, this goddess of English is the goddess of Bhakha's dreams. And there is a mantra also that the priest chants in the temple, London se aayi maiya Angrezi wali maiya. So now I would like to go to another form of exclusion, that is from religious space. Initially we looked at Bhakha's exclusion, we looked at the exclusion of Dalits from educational spaces during colonial India. So now we move on to the exclusion of Bhakha and millions of Dalits from religious spaces during the colonial times, colonial period, in the colonial period. It has been mentioned in the narrative, as the narrative demonstrates, Bhakha goes to the temple courtyard to sweep it, to clean it. And he knows it very well that as an untouchable, he cannot go inside the temple. He cannot enter the sanctum sanctorum. But he is curious. He is curious to see the inner sanctum of the temple. He hurriedly takes the stairs, but the crowd shout at both him and his sister Sohini. Someone suddenly shouts, someone bursts out in anger, "Get off the steps, you scavenger," I quote. "Off with you. You have defiled our whole service. You have defiled our temple." Whenever Bhakha is at a public place, it seems that he is trying to hide himself, as if he were ashamed of himself, as if he were ashamed of being a Dalit, being an untouchable, ashamed of his very own identity, ashamed of who he is. So this invisibility of the outcast, or this sense of shame of what he is, was caused by the dehumanizing impact of caste-based discrimination. Now let us move on to other forms of exclusion from other public places such as road. The outcast was supposed to announce their arrival publicly, lest they should touch passers-by and pollute them. So Bhakha in the story, in the narrative, while walking down the road, shouts, "Posh, keep away, posh, sweeper coming, posh, posh, sweeper coming, posh, posh, sweeper coming." This is how he announces his arrival to others. And when Bhakha touches an upper caste man by mistake, the man flies into a rage, abuses and slaps Bhakha, abuses and slaps him, saying, "Don't you know, you brute, that you must not touch me?" This humiliation, this public humiliation, leaves Bhakha embarrassed, deaf and dumb, his senses paralyzed. Another important space through which we can analyze, through which we can examine the narrative of exclusion in Untouchable is well, Kuan. Sohini, Bhakha's sister, and other outcasts have to wait for the mercy of some upper caste man to give them water. Pandit Kalinath, who lusts after Sohini, gives her water, but at the same time asks her to clean the temple courtyard, where he tries to molest her, he molests her. So controlling water became a way not only to deprive the outcasts of a right to live a life of dignity, but also a right to life. So it is not surprising that exclusion from well prompted many authors such as Premchand and Om Prakash Valmiki to write on this theme in Thakur Ka Kuan. Premchand has written a beautiful short story called Thakur Ka Kuan, and later Om Prakash Valmiki wrote a poem bearing the same title. I will come to that poem later in my 10th and the last lecture. So such exclusions had made outcasts vulnerable to conversion in colonial India, and therefore missionaries like Colonel Hutchinson in the novel lurked around. Hutchinson lurks all over the place, waiting for the right moment to pounce on an oppressed untouchable. He is waiting for the right moment to convert an oppressed untouchable to Christianity. Since a day in the life of Bhakha symbolizes the suffering of millions of outcasts, they all would dream to put an end to all sorts of exclusions in independent India, which has already abolished untouchability as per Article 17 of the Indian Constitution. So, now after discussing the narratives of deprivation, narratives of exclusion, I would like to move on to representation of several religions in this text, and I begin with Hinduism. I begin with the representation of Hinduism in Untouchable. So, at the outset I would like to ask a question. Is the idea that someone's touch can defile or pollute others sanctioned by Hinduism, or is a distortion of Hinduism? It could be a debatable question, but what is obvious is that it is distortion of the Varna system, and the distortion of the Varna system surfaced or raised its ugly head in the form of caste system that privileges birth over merit, creating binaries in society, associating the low caste with lack of cleanliness. For instance, the narrator says about Bhaka that although he had to do the dirty job of deposing the human faces, he remained extremely clean. Though he is an exception, yet subjected to humiliation. About Havaldar Charat Singh, on the other hand, the narrator says that he had, quote, the Hindu instinct for immaculate cleanliness. So, throughout the novel what we see is that upper caste Hindus such as the priest mostly observes pollution norms. Upper caste Hindus such as the priest mostly observes pollution norms, treating Bhaka with utter disdain. The text foregrounds, the narrative foregrounds the hypocrisy of Pandit Kalinath, who is dead against the outcasts entering the temple. But at the same time, he is not ashamed of casting his lecherous gaze on Bhaka's sister Sohini and molesting her. So, Sohini here is doubly marginalized as an untouchable woman. Now, very briefly, we would also look at the representation of Islam in Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. So, though Muslims have been vilified, they have been denounced and vilified to some extent in Raja Rao's Kantapura, in Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, we find a sympathetic portrayal of Muslims. There are two major Muslim characters in the novel, one Barber and the other Tangawala. Tangawala is another character, another important Muslim character, and they both treat Bhaka sympathetically. The barber lets Bhaka light a cigarette from his hookah. In sharp contrast, the crowd of Hindu upper caste men in the story abuse him. Bhaka says, Bhaka is upset when he is being abused by the crowd. The cruel crowd, I am quoting Bhaka's statement, the cruel crowd, all of them abused and abused. Why are we always abused? The inspector and the sahib that day abused my father. They always abuse us because we are sweepers, because we touch dung. But my observation here is that in Untouchable we find a generalization of upper caste men or simplistic portrayal of caste. In terms of caste, characters can be called stock characters because it is too simplistic a portrayal of caste. On the one hand, Bhaka is aghast at the atrocities committed by the upper caste Hindus. On the other, he is praising the Muslim Tangawala profusely, saying the Tangawala was kind. He made me weep. I am quoting, Tangawala was kind. I am quoting Bhaka's statement. He made me weep, telling me in that way to take my things and walk along. But he is a Mohammedan. They do not mind touching us, the Mohammedan and the Sahibs. It is only the Hindus and the outcasts who are not sweepers. Now, I would like to look at the representation of Christianity. After discussing how Hinduism and Islam have been represented in Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, I would like to examine very briefly, closely the representation of Christianity. Christian characters comprise Sahebs in the cantonment, Tommies, Colonel Hutchinson and his wife in Anand's Untouchable. Here we come across a satirical representation of missionaries in the character of Colonel Hutchinson, who is a failure, and his wife looks down upon the outcasts. Hutchinson can neither explain to Bhakha who Jesus Christ was, nor why we all are sinners, because Hutchinson tells Bhakha that we all are sinners, and naive Bhakha cannot simply understand it. He has committed no sin, yet he is being called a sinner, and he wonders why we all are sinners. Bhakha doesn't remember committing any sin, so he wonders why would he confess his sins if he hasn't committed any. So this is how all these major religions have been represented in Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. Now in the next part of the lecture, very briefly, very quickly, I will discuss Gandhi's views on religion and untouchability. Gandhi, as I briefly mentioned earlier, was opposed to giving a separate legal and political status to Dalits. Rather, he saw it as a ploy on the part of the British to alienate Dalits from Hinduism. He says in the novel, I quote, "As you all know, while we are asking for freedom from the grip of a foreign nation, we have ourselves for centuries trampled underfoot millions of human beings without feeling the slightest remorse for our iniquity. For me, the question of these people is moral and religious." So, for Gandhi, unlike Ambedkar, the question of caste was a moral and religious question, not a political question. It was not a political question at all for Gandhi. Bhakha cannot follow these words, but he can empathize with Uka and likes it when Gandhi calls untouchability the greatest blot on Hinduism and appeals to everyone in the novel that all public wells, temples, roads, schools and sanatoriums must be declared open to the untouchables, because all these places, as has been discussed amply in the novel, were out of bounds to Dalits, to untouchables, and this is exactly what Bhakha wanted. So it is not surprising that Gandhi's words were music to Bhakha's ears, and Mulk Raj Anand too, to a great extent, shared Gandhi's sentiments. So to conclude, this lecture focused on the narratives of exclusion of Dalits from public places, public spaces in colonial India, such as educational spaces, religious space, public spaces such as roads and wells. How Bhakha has been excluded. Bhakha and millions of Dalits were excluded from all these spaces, one. And two, the lecture examined the representation of Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and also Gandhi's denunciation of untouchability, Gandhi's trenchant critique of untouchability. So, Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable can be read as a trenchant critique of caste-based exclusions and persecutions in society. So, for a detailed discussion, you may refer to IGNOU booklet on Untouchable Unit 4. Thank you so much. Namaskar.